Hey everyone. So this is a dev segment of and a focus on the inner workings of the blueprints. This was actually suggested to me over the weekend. Is the idea that I always have a tendency to show what I've done, and I didn't really ever show um, exactly how I did it, or what was going on inside of that. So over the weekend, there were two major bugs that I was running into, and that one of them was that the home points weren't properly triggering the were not properly triggering on this. They were not detecting that which home points I had actually unlocked. There was another smaller bug where the wrong string was being displayed, and it would say the forgotten bulwark here, which sanctuary is much better sound. um, so let me get into the blueprints here. The first thing is that I'm doing all of the player's progress on a single array variable called a progress tags, right? And then I also have another variable called travel tag, which is the same thing, but it's not an array. And basically, all a travel tag is when I store this on the character, and then in the entities, um, is it spawning home point? There is this thing called a level control or a spawn control. Level control is for something a little higher level. The spawn control basically you as the player you spawn outside of the level in a black box. You then you're touching when you're touching this object. What happens is it determines. Okay, are you a player touching the object? And I cast to the player, and then I see, okay, you're the player, so you probably have a player controller. I give it a second because it's just a good idea to give it a second to breathe when first starting into the level. I mean, at this point in time, when I click load game, like it generates fucking like maybe 50 fucking items that are all just sitting with all their own stats and all kinds of wacky stuff like that. In fact, I probably should have another wait for after that, and then clean it up a little bit more where you don't even see your HUD and it's just a black screen. It's just a loading screen. I need to have like a proper loading section hooked up, and this would be the area in which the loading would actually occur. Well, anyway, once it goes through and loads all the player data, uh, one of the things that it does is it checks your travel tag, and it also checks your progress tags. So the spawn control goes through and it searches all of the home points that are currently in the level, and it checks against your travel tag. If your travel tag and if your travel tag and that home point's travel tag are the same, then activate that home point, which then goes through the process of well, first of all, figuring out if this has been set off to see if it's valid, if the player is even a valid reference at the moment. Sometimes shit like that happens. Sometimes it is valid, gets used pretty liberally. In fact, I should probably pull off a thing here where like something went terribly wrong. um, if it's not valid. But anyway, so I set the player reference to a variable. I say home point is now active, and the this is for if you walk up to the home point and you just want to and if you're channeling the home point, which is done on an event tick, it's very easy to get splintered off because there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of things going on in these blueprints. Um, in fact, I was actually thinking that I should just have a segment where all it is just me commenting my damn blueprints. which would probably be a really good thing. It makes sense to me now, but I can imagine like a year from now it probably won't. The first thing that it does is it resets the player, and part of resetting the player is making sure that the player gets this travel tag. See, this function is called when you die, and this function is also called when you teleport to it, and it's also called activate the home point is called when you channel it, and by channeling it is when you stand next to it or you stand inside of it, and you see the bar filling up on the middle of the screen, and that ends up happening. Yeah, using this, I'm not doing a delta seconds calculation. This one is actually just counting up manually. I hear that doing it that way can sometimes have weird effects on people with like different frame rates, but in this case, it's not really going to have that much of an effect, and I'd be surprised if that ended up being too much of a problem. But anyway, uh, if the player is inside of the radius, if let's see, the player is inside of the radius, that's when I add to it, or I set it to 0.01. There was another reason for that. Oh, if there's a monster. Yeah, that shit. If there's a monster, so there's a circle around. God damn it. There's a circle around the each of the home points. You see this sphere? If any kind of enemy approaches this sphere and encroaches it, that means that it sets it to 0.1, 0.01. In other words, it just stones it, and it doesn't allow it to finish. If this counter ever reaches equals to greater than 1, greater than or equal to 1, then go up here, activate the home point, save the game. This is actually the only point in time where the game does actually get saved. So the bug was that I was using text instead of strings. Strings are a lot cleaner, and one of the things that I've kind of found with text is that there's other stuff going on when it comes to text. And when I say that, it's just a variable type here. Okay, so when you look at this variable type, it says a localizable text string. That means that there's other stuff going on, and it might not actually match. So when you do the contains thing, it can be very dodgy. And that was what was causing the bug, where it wasn't being saved properly onto the player's progress tags. See, I actually add the travel tag of a home point to the player's progress tag. Once that is in the player's progress tag, the player I can now do a very easy check on the home point and even in the HUD, the travel HUD, where it's very easy for me to see whether or not you've unlocked this location by standing on it. Now I know it's kind of weird that I'm doing the travel locations manually like this. The thing is, though, is that there's only going to be so many, and my thinking is that the first episode, basically, of the game is going to be this button, and then as you move on to, later areas, stuff that I add onto the game at a later time, like more levels, adding more content, more boss fight, more weapons, like an expansion pack or something along those lines. I would have another one of these kinds of buttons. You'd click that one, and then you'd see that list instead, which is pretty easy to hook up. But every one of these home point thingies are pretty much a static thing. They're not going to change. So I'm actually inputting that data right here, and I could probably do something a little bit cleaner, like use a data table for it and stuff like that. But this right now will get the job done pretty well. So, I'm sorry for the coughing. The progress tag system. So, like I was making an example here. Sorry, I'm kind of going off. So, if you look when you look at a text string versus a see, there's no like little down arrow. I didn't notice this at first when I was using text, but there's a key and then there's a package, and that right there, if those things don't line up, then it'll always fail this test. So I fixed the bug simply by going through, and there's a ton of entities. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Loot spawn, for example. Um, Anytime the player looks at a loot container, I can find one example. Um, and I think that's actually on the player itself, not the player controller. If I go here to the player base, yeah, you see this big mess right here? This right here is how I detect if the player is looking at a loot bubble. And by that, I basically, you're always shooting out a trace at all times that is looking straight out from the center of your screen. And anytime this trace hits something, I check to see if it's a external container entity. If it's not an external container entity, then I set it to nothing. So this happens pretty often. It's not every frame, but there's always some kind of like it. I think it is actually because you can't really afford to allow this. Yeah, search for containers. Uh, 0.1 actually. So it's I never really noticed. I forgot that I actually slowed it down. It does not happen every frame. So I'm looking to see, I mean, if the player controller is not valid, something horribly went wrong. Like, something really bad happened here. I think in some cases, though, that was just in case I wanted to have NPCs that are friendly, that utilize the same player classes. That's also a consideration that you have to have, because, like, a game like this is probably going to have NPCs, like, you have Sanctuary, and Sanctuary, like, is a perfect place for you to just drop NPCs in and have like dialogue with them, weird shit like that. I mean, you shouldn't just be finding loot. You should probably also be finding like people to save, and you know maybe other strange stuff like that. Like maybe they'll give you stuff or they change something in the world or some kind of madness like that. I haven't really even gotten that far along, but that's why it's important to do this, because if I want them to be playing the same classes that the player plays, then I do need to be checking to see if the player controller is valid. Anyway, so I check that all of that there, and then you'll notice that if I go a little bit further in, I branch this off into a sequence, and then there's a separate event that occurs here as well. um, oh, this right here is how you auto loot credits right out of a container. So just by looking at a container that has credits in it, you will automatically loot those credits from that container. Uh, yeah. And that pretty much just goes through that, and I manually set the container's credits value to 0 if this occurs up here. So if some containers don't have credits, some of them do. Anyway, on the second half of the sequence is when I get to the progress tag section. So the first thing I do is I decide I need to find out. Okay, so on the external container, does the progress tag have anything on it, right? Like like if there's a lot of containers in the game, and I just want them to respawn. I want them to behave as normal, as they always do. Well, in this particular case, I'm checking to see if it doesn't equal nothing. So if there's something in this variable, if there is something in this variable, then I want you to go to the next thing. I want you to find all player controllers. This is me still thinking about multiplayer. I'm holding on to the idea. I mean, it's not a bad thing to implement things as though maybe down the road it's going to be possible. But in all honesty, it's unlikely because I just don't know how to make it flow very well without literally doing the exact same kind of a system that Dark Souls has, which is just something that I don't think I'm going to be able to do as an indie dev very easily. It's just, having like other players appearing in blood pools and all that weird stuff like that. I'm going to have to do something completely different because it's not possible for me to do that kind of stuff. Like, this is going to be very much an as-is game that you can do whatever you want with. Like, so anyway, I don't know. I mean, that's just how I feel right now. Like, I have to keep things realistic because I don't know what's going to be going on in the near future. But anyway, this checks to see all player controllers currently, which I don't even think that may not technically work for multiplayer because player controllers are local. But regardless, it works perfectly for single player. And checks to see if this progress tag already exists. And if it doesn't, which is this right here, if it doesn't contain this, then I add it. And then that means that from now on, the player's progress tags going to include a reference to this particular object, right? So on the spawn control, one of the things on the spawn control, not the on the home point, you'll notice that there's reset the player, right? Set player location, which is this is the part where I teleport the player back, and it's kind of weird. What I'm opting to do is a much simpler method, but I'm not respawning the player. I'm not spawning you all over again. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm just teleporting you back to the home point. And when there's graphics, what'll happen, or maybe I should just have like a placeholder that shows dead bodies, is like a D sitting on the ground or something like that. Kind of reminds me of Dwarf Fortress. Is I spawn like a dead body in place of where you were, flash the fucking you died thing, and then teleport you back, which could definitely be a lot fancier right now. It's not super fancy at the moment, but set the players. Now you'll notice that I want the player to be facing the vector, facing the same direction as the spawn point itself. But one of the things that's really confusing about the Unreal Engine, and this might catch a lot of people off guard, is you got to be really careful about this, is that the player's rotation is not based on the physical rotation of the pawn. It's actually the rotation of the player is a set control rotation. And I think this was actually a pretty smart way to do it. But I think this was also true for Unreal 3. Like this is a holdover from the Unreal Engine type stuff. But if you ever need to force the player to look at something, or like if you ever want to spawn the player, set the control rotation is going to be the only way that you're going to be able to actually face the player manually in some direction, because it just won't work otherwise. Now, let me go back. I clear all entities. What this means is that when you die, or whenever a home point is activated, all objects, this is enemies, containers, all of it just destroyed. I clear them all out. But you're probably wondering, well, if I go and I clear out all of the containers that were placed manually in the world, and if I clear all of the NPCs that were placed manually in the world, all the demons and imps and zombie guys and all of these like fucking uh, like loot containers that are all over the place, then how will I know where to respawn them? Because they're going to be gone, right? Well, I had to create special entities for spawning things. See, none of those objects that you just saw, that I just listed down in the lower left side of the screen, all those things were just references that I use. I have to point to them so these are the objects that are actually placed in the world. So like if I want to place a zombie guy, I have to go to place a spawn point, and now that's the actual spawn point. Now the spawn point itself points to whatever kind of dude I want to spawn. So I just spawn like a chain gunner guy. Now this has other problems too, because you might notice that like the chain gunner guy is a bit larger. He's a bigger dude, and that's especially true for the BST, the Hell Beast, which is actually fairly big. He's like this big. At the moment, it seems like they're auto-corrected to fit on the nav mesh properly if they spawn a little bit into the ground. But currently, one thing I need to do, and I need to write this down, is adjust spawn location based on size of the enemy or the NPC. Which is not something I currently do, but it seems to work either way. But it's needed. So basically, I have to take a look at the size of the. I have to take a look at the size of the chain gunner's bounding size and stuff like that. The only reason why that's difficult is because the chain gunner reference doesn't exist yet, and you can't get variables from an entity that doesn't exist yet. So anyway, once I clear all that stuff out, and there's no enemies. Oh shit! I gotta remember. I just put a fucking chain gunner in here. All right, it's supposed to be a safe place. Kid just put chain gunners. That'd be so fucking brutal. Progress tags work for NPCs as well, by the way. Anyway, so I clear all entities, and then I determine whether or not this was a death. And if it was a death, then the player has to drop his loot and all of that stuff. I have to go through pretty much every inventory. This is player death, such a depressing function. I do last valid location on the nav mesh, which is a constant thing that has to occur. Once every 2 seconds. Once every 2 seconds, I update the player death loot location if your health ever actually is not above 0. Just in case it ever gets into the negative numbers. If your health ever reaches 0, then update the player death loot location, or I do it every 2 seconds. Currently, there's a bug where if you die just at the right time, for some reason, this secondary method of forcing this to update doesn't quite happen. But basically, the way this works is every 2 seconds, I see if I can do a path location from the place that you last spawned. So that's either the home point or a travel location. So there are locations like between zones. If you travel between the hub and the dark base, there are exits and entrances between each and every one of the levels, and I'll show you that in this right here. So like this is the exit, and that says the level name and then the travel tag. And on the other side, on the other level, is the level name for Hub 01, and it has this travel tag on it. So if I go to the other area, you'll see that yeah, see it's a dark base 01 is the travel tag. That means that you spawn at this location. Why am I? That means that you will spawn at this location because what happens, as I kind of showed before, is you spawn in this area with the spawn control, and the spawn control does its thing where it determines where if it can't find a home point that matches your travel tag, then it'll search for travel spawns, which is what I just showed here. Now, if this travel spawn has the same travel tag, then I activate the travel spawn, and the travel spawn uses a very, 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 very simple similar system. I could have almost probably made generic variables for this. Since it's not that complicated, I didn't mind duplicating the code. You know, maybe I'll regret that down the road or something like that, but it works a hell of a lot like the home point. Well, anyway, let me get back to the spawn control. The reason why I do this where I'm tracing a path from the player's last conceived home point is because the player can get into a weird spot that you normally can't reach. Like if you jump off of a cliff and you die, your stuff is going to be sitting out in the void somewhere where you're not supposed to be able to go. So I try to make sure that the only time I actually, place your stuff on the ground is the last time you were in a valid location. So if it can't find a path to you on the nav mesh when you die, then it doesn't do anything. Like if I was to drag out a print here, it would be constantly every 2 seconds, failed to reach you and thus did not update this thing. So when the player dies, I teleport you to the last. I spawn your shit as a container. With nothing really set. It's like a death spawn. It has special functionality for that kind of a thing. And that's when I go through all of your inventory and append it all to a single thing for your death drop items. And I can change very easily here what stuff you drop when you die. But once I go to your death drop items, I go to item amount, and it's like just to make sure that when you drop stuff, it also keeps the amount, which is just an integer on the object. It's not like an actual list of multiple things. Like if you have 250 pistol ammo, it's only one object with an integer value of 250. That's actually kind of a weird way to think about it, but every single object is really more or less just a container to hold a whole bunch of itself. Sorry, that's Pop-Tart. And then I go and I clear because I'm a total asshole. This is me clearing those particular inventory things. And I didn't just use one array for the player's entire inventory. And the reason why I did that, I have different arrays that I append and use differently because it's a little easier to organize them that way. It requires a little less code. It's a little bit simpler, even though it ends up spawning this kind of shit. Or I end up rather than just doing like one thing, it's easier for me to separate stuff without having to go through extra steps. So if you do an inventory system, this is actually kind of proven to be, it saves a little bit of time in some respects, but it makes it easier to organize your stuff because you can also do the other things too, like, your weapons appear before your armor, and stuff like that. Like, it's easier, like, depending on how you decide to append things and show them. It's quite a bit easier to display stuff how you want to. And this is just a function that gets run to update all the icons. That's a whole nother can of worms. Let me go back to the home point. So I ended up kind of going off on all that. I wonder if like videos like this can be short. Fucking hell, man. There's actually there's a sprawling amount of stuff going on in these blueprints. It's not actually a very simple thing. I think that covers pretty much that. So that was the first bug. That was the travel tag system, and then I kind of the travel tag and progress tags. Progress tags actually works out really well. It's a really dirt simple way to track the player's progress. And when you look at things like the loot spawn, when the loot spawns, what it does is it goes through and I'm looking at the wrong thing. The first thing it does, I have the spawn function. Alright, and this is called when the home point says refresh all entities, get all loot spawns, get all player, character spawns, and I'm also resetting battle controllers, which is a whole nother thing. I made a whole system for pre-scripted battles. And I can actually go into the blueprints on that. I'll have to do another video because this one ended up being 30 fucking minutes, and I wanted to try and do something that was short, but I don't think it's possible. I don't think short is something I do. So I've got, yeah, and this basically just tells all NPCs to respawn. So I cleared them all a moment ago, and this just deletes all of the current ones that are existing. And then I grab all of the spawn points, and then I command them to do their thing. And what each and every one of these objects does is it goes to the player controller, checks to C0, and sees if it contains that progress tag. If it contains that progress tag, then that's it. Never spawn it again. Now, in the case of an NPC spawn, spawn the NPC. Now the NPC has a progress tag. See that? So the progress tag is actually stored on the character. So if there's like an enemy that is like a boss or mini boss or something like that, and I want him to never respawn, basically what I have to do is I store the progress tag on him when he spawns from that particular spawn point. And then when he dies, which means that his health is less than or equal to 0, it's awesome. I'm doing a lot of these from there. That's great. Death check trigger. Yeah, because I did this because I want this to only fire one time. Event tick has a tendency to go kind of crazy like that. I could probably do this a little bit differently, but it seems like most of the NPCs and stuff like that. I'm sorry if my coughing is annoying. Anyway, and this is where I'm checking to see what the chance. Every enemy has a different chance for spawning loot when it dies, and it has a reference to the type of container that it spawns. If the container equals 0, or it doesn't equal anything, yeah, if it equals container base, in other words, the default value that it's going to have, then just move on, don't do anything. If it equals anything other than that, then spawn the actor, which is the container. You know what? It occurs to me. All these containers are coming out as 0. I wonder if that's a bug. They should match. Oh, container level variance. Never mind. So anyway, I get all players. I get the controller. I say I modify experience points for all players that are currently here. So it's again me with the multiplayer thing. If you're playing multiplayer and somebody kills an enemy that's like on the other side of the map, you're still going to get the experience points. Anytime something dies, it can literally jump off a fucking cliff and you're going to get the experience points from its death. That's currently how this works right now. It goes down here and then it runs all this. So when this creature is dead, I check to see if its progress tag equals 0, which in this case it wouldn't. And if it doesn't equal 0, then I get all actors of class, all the player controller, and then I go through and then I see if it contains this, and if it does, then go ahead and add it to the progress tags. And then that means that when you loop back to the spawn point, this enemy, you've killed him once, will never respawn. So you'll notice here that I have a clear self. Well, one of the things that happens when I don't want the player to be accredited for the erasing of an enemy when you die. Otherwise, you get an awful lot of experience by jumping off of a cliff in the first thing you do. And kills all the enemies. There has to be just a clean way to go ahead and kill him. But you can't just kill the player. You can't just kill the NPC. You have to get all of its inventory items. Believe it or not, these guys are running around with fireball launchers and shit. They have their own guns. They have their own melee weapons. They all have to be destroyed, and they have to be done. It all has to be destroyed quietly, for cleanliness' sake. So this method will do all of this regardless. But then there's the clear self thing. When you go to the spawn point, am I in the, not the spawn point, the home point, you'll notice that when I do clear all entities, is clear self, destroy self. These are very specific things. Functions that quietly destroy themselves and then respawn later on. And that is the very last part, all the way over here. So that's how progress tags work. And it's a very, very simple system. But it doesn't just apply, the progress tags don't just apply to the spawning of things. Progress tags also apply to things like doors. So one of the first things you'll notice, if I have a door that opens, so like if I look at this door right here, something that I can do, I probably actually should, is something that I actually should do is probably add this travel tag. So now you cannot progress past this door without doing this first. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing. I think most players are going to do it, but there needs to be more indication of exactly why the door is not operating this time. Because a lot of players, they'll probably run through this. They'll probably check that out. You never really know. I could just, let the player fuck themselves and make it so that you don't do it. But most people are probably going to do this first. But now it's actually impossible to progress past this point, because when you activate this home point, it will add this as a progress tag, and this progress tag is now required on the door. So when you walk up to a door every second, it checks to see if there is anything inside of its trigger radius, right? I had tried to do this a couple of different ways, and this this ended up being the most reliable way. My only complaint about this is that sometimes you walk up to the door, it opens immediately, and sometimes you walk up to it and it takes like a full second. But overall, it's kind of felt okay. It could be worse, but it checks to see if the progress tag is 0. If the progress tag is, doesn't equal anything, then it just moves on its merry way, and the door opens up, does its thing. If there's a player here or not. If the progress tag doesn't equal 0, then I go through the player's controller. I check to see if it contains this object, and if it does contain it, then you can continue on. And that's pretty much this is probably one of the easiest ways to do a door that only opens up if you have a progress tag. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and see. I'm trying to think. Was there? I can go into the other stuff too for the weapon, but I think this video is long enough as it is, and that covers pretty much everything when it comes to the progress tag system and how I'm saving progress on the player and how I fixed that bug regarding the progress tag, which was just because there was something weird going on as far as text. But it seems to have definitely solved the problem now that I'm just using strings, which, there you go. I guess the problem with that is that you can't localize it as easily. But if I'm worried about localizing, that means that I could deal with that problem, because it matters enough that I need to make this. I need to localize the strings so that other people of other languages can read it. If I've gone that far, then I'm okay with dealing with that problem. All right. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. And I'll try to do more of these, but damn, 40 fucking minutes, and done.